The first presentation we have today is with the Grand Poobah. He told me to say that. Michael Vollmer of Wipro, General Manager of Apple Practice, and his Padawan, as he called it,
Yes.
Tim. So they're going to go ahead and give a talk about what they do. And yeah, we'll take some Q&A after they're done with their talks. I'll walk around with the mic and awkwardly do this a bunch until one of you decides to ask a question. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kyle. All right, good morning, I guess. It feels like afternoon. I'm an East Coast guy, so I guess I can claim it's afternoon. So this morning we're actually going to spend some time whenever the charts get loaded up here, unless I'm supposed to, maybe. Well, while they're loading that up, we're going to spend some time talking about what we've defined as really as reinventing business as usual. So it's going to be a lot of overlap from what you kind of saw in the morning. Needless to say, I've never seen any of the charts and presentation over this morning, but there's a lot of consistency in the themes that you're going to be there. So we're going to do a little bit of a flashback and look at kind of what got us to where we are today in the evolution of IT. And then we'll talk about kind of this notion of rethinking business as usual. And we'll get into some success factors. So there we go. So I've already been introduced. We'll skip past that. Already got into the agenda a little bit. So we're going to start with business as usual. And for business as usual, you know, I want to kind of take us back to a time before really even mobile devices existed and actually kind of go back to the beginning of the PC era. So if you think about 1975, this is when Apple I, PET, TRS-80, Altair, all these guys were kind of in the conversation. This was kind of really the beginning of kind of the PC as we know it. But it wasn't until really 1981 when kind of something profound happened. And at this time, if you recall, this is when IBM really dominated the enterprise IT market. And it wasn't there long after, and later in 1981, IBM released the 5150 personal computer running an OS that was developed by Microsoft. And this would basically kind of set the direction for the next 30 plus years in the enterprise space, really giving validity to the personal computer in the enterprise, which really kind of drove the agenda for the next 30 plus years. And I'm doing all this because there's a context to a number of the challenges that you face when you're out there talking to a CIO today and trying to help them understand why you drive choice and how you get there. Because there's this anchor of this 30 years of history that we're going to kind of talk through a little bit. So during this time, you've got all these Windows-based PCs that are out there in the enterprise. And as a software developer in the early 80s and 90s, you know, they were faced with the dilemma of what platform do I really develop for? So it's kind of a simple example. If you're a developer and you had $100 to develop an application and you really wanted access to the largest part of the market that you could get access to, the odds are you built that around a Windows-based platform in that time period, right? But if you wanted to extend that into other platforms, say you wanted to get into the Apple market space, if it goes, there we go. You know, if you wanted that additional market access, at that time, it almost would cost you double your development cost to port the application over. So what you ended up with is you had all of these developers that were out there that were really building at that time for a Windows-based environment. And as a result of that, you had these IT shops that started to optimize really around the Windows-based IBM-compatible machines running some sort of Windows-based applications on their things. And with that, you know, they optimize around things like infrastructure, right? Whether that's their VPNs, you know, access, distribution points, Wi-Fi, whatever it might have been. They had 30 years of optimizing around a number of these infrastructure points. Same thing for the tools, right? All the various tools that they have out there, whether it's their catalog, their mail, calendar, MDM, whatever it might be, their encryption, you know, imaging, all these different things. They use all these various tools. Once again, 30 years of optimizing around this. They did the same thing around their policies, right? Password policies, VPN policies, data policies, whatever it might have been. Everything was being optimized around that same environment, a Windows-based, Microsoft, you know, environment during that time. And they optimized around their costs. Right, so that kind of gives you this backdrop of there's this history of time that when you talk to an IT person, especially more the senior level IT, their background is a Windows-based background, right? And so what you're challenging them on is challenging them on the 30 years of knowledge they have and how do they overcome that to embrace something new, because there's really, up until that time, there was really no alternative. They could just take this very monolithic approach that was driven by feature functions in the enterprise, and they just dictated it. There was no choice at that time. But then something changed, right? Apple came along around the 2007 timeframe and really helped us rethink what was possible in the enterprise. And the journey actually started with the iPhone, right? The iPhone really, when you think about it, it revolutionized the market in so many ways. At that time period, many of us were running BlackBerry or BES in our environments, right? And I think during those days, I think nobody ever imagined that BlackBerry would ever disappear. Like, there were people that just refused, that you're never going to get away from me. But something special happened, right? iOS really reimagined the user experience. The virtual keyboard really kind of allowed this more space, and once again, driving these new experiences out there. And touch really enabled you to interact and do things differently, things that were not possible at that time, right? And it wasn't long after that, you had the App Store in 2008 that came along, and the App Store, it really revolutionized software consumption and buying at that time, right? So you could get these bite-sized apps that would really just kind of, they helped you drive collaboration, communication, productivity. It was one place to go. It was a simple download. It was secure, and it was easy, right? It just worked, right? And as a result of this, I guess I can't gravitate too far, really everything kind of changed, right? If you think about what you use your iPhone today, I mean, whether many of you probably traveled on an airplane today, there's a high probability you use some sort of electronic ticket off of your phone. You know, you're booking an Uber off of this. Many of you are tracking GPS and other fitness activities and health data. The accelerometers, the OS, the GPS features, all these things, the location tracking, really imagine a whole new life for all of us, right? It's really transformed our life in many, many ways. And as a result of this, we took our phones to work. And eventually we took our iPads to work, right? And we wanted that same amazing consumer experience to take that to the enterprise space, right? We wanted something that was, sorry, I can't walk very far here. It was easy to use, right? It was fast, it was immersive, it gave you up-to-the-minute data, right? It was in the right format, the right function, and it was a modern use of technology, right? And then, you know, something else happened after this, right? All of a sudden, in 2010, the App Store came to the Mac. Now, all of a sudden, you had all of those same kind of bite-sized apps that you had in the App Store for iOS devices started showing up in the Mac. And now, all of a sudden, you know, these issues of application availability, all of that started to go away. Suddenly, you had a viable alternative start to develop for the Mac into the enterprise, right? And everything changed again, right? Now you've got, you know, with the innovations around continuity, you can use your iPhone, your Apple Watch, your Mac, they just seamlessly communicate together, right? So whether that's you're taking a phone call without ever touching your phone, you're sending messages from your Mac, your phone, your watch, you're unlocking your device. It was that seamless integration that instantly drove something else. Now we started to take our Mac to work. And not only did we take our Mac to work, we wanted it to work seamlessly with our other devices and have a seamless experience at work, right? So that same story kind of plays out as we move forward. They wanted it easy to use. They wanted it native. They didn't want the added stack of applications. We want that native experience that just seamlessly works across all of our devices. They wanted knowledgeable support, right? And they wanted modern use of technology. Oop, too fast. And so all of a sudden, you kind of reach this kind of 2010 timeframe where, you know, the iPhone kind of revolutionized the way you think about experience, how you download and consume software. The Mac Store really kind of triggered that tipping point to really make the Mac as a viable alternative, because applications now were being built, they were readily available. Those excuses that often prevailed within the enterprise of, oh, the applications don't work, it only works in Windows, all of that started to kind of melt away. Ultimately, where you got to the point where now you have users that are demanding choice. And they're demanding choice because the experience is great, it's simple, and it works, right? And that's what they want, right? But choice, many of us, I think, understand, has been often limited to kind of the upper management of most companies. That's where it started. It was deemed a premium, right? And it was kind of a special tool to have for the senior members. But the reality is, choice is not limited to the title. You could argue that everybody in the company wants choice. And to kind of help make that argument, there's a number of studies. So Pricewaterhouse, some of you may have seen this study. They did a study that said 78% of millennials, they want a choice in the devices they use at work. Follow that up with the JAMP study that said 3 out of 4 people, when they actually get that choice, they're actually going to choose a Mac, right? And then on top of that, choice doesn't just get limited to the device. One of the things that we often forget about, and this is one of the things that it really didn't get touched too much in the morning session when we talk about choice, is actually support. 75% of users today view that a self-service is a viable means to actually address their support issues. And 67% of people actually prefer self-service. The issue has typically been the experience they get when they get it, right? It hasn't been built for the user. It's usually been built for some other purpose. But users want and are demanding that choice as an option. And that's something that we often don't talk about, but I think it's critical to the conversation. And on top of that, I'll leave one last study here. This is a study, it was a joint study between the University of Cologne, University of Groningen, and Columbia University. They were looking at a study around autonomy. And they did a study, and basically they found that it is 2.5 times more likely that a person would take a job that gave them more autonomy than they would take a job that gave them more influence, kind of pay, kind of held equal, right? And that's a really interesting thing. So when you think about attracting and retaining talent, right, empowering employees and giving them this experience, they want it. They're demanding it. The data's there that supports it. The challenge is that most IT organizations are not set up for choice, right? It's all too often that they're going to revert back to, how do I take this choice thing and implement it into my existing infrastructure? And there's really kind of 3 fundamental reasons for that. One is it's either convenience. 2, there's some sort of political factor, whether it's the relationship politics, it's internal office politics, it's personal job security, whatever it might be. There's a political component to it. Or there's a third component, which is they just don't know what they don't know when it comes to the Apple devices, the Apple OSs, Apple security policies, whatever it might be. There's just a lack of familiarity around that. And so what I thought I would do is we're going to spend some time and we're going to dive into kind of addressing those 3 things. But I think it's important that we always talk about security first. It's the single most unavoidable conversation when you're going to talk about, I want to enable choice into the enterprise. And because it's usually when you're enabling choice, it's not that you're enabling a different Windows machine, it's Apple versus Windows. And so you have to address this. The problem is most CIOs or CISOs or both, depending on who you're having to interact with, they are not familiar with the Apple security technologies and policies and things that they've built into the device and to the OS. And so the first thing that I would implore everybody to do is either get familiar, go read the security guidelines that come out from Apple and get published, or call on your local SE or AE from Apple to go in with you and have that conversation. It's a tough conversation to have, but there's a number of things in there. So there's a highlights here, whether you're going into system security, you're going into encryption and data protection, app security, you got authentication and digital signing, network security, right? Device control. So these are often the things that are part of, that are going to manage through the MDM. And then if you're lucky enough to be running a device with the new T2 chip, I think one of the interesting things that is there is the secure boot, which is when you think about the implications of that in the enterprise, and the added layer of security is really, really compelling. But most CIOs and CISOs have no idea what this stuff means. And they're more than likely going to try to convince you that the Mac is the same thing as a Windows-based PC. I mean, they look the same. They might be a different color. The keyboards might be a little bit, touch different, but they basically look like the same. And I always try to use the analogy. I do multi-sport triathlons, and you put a runner and you put a cyclist next to each other. They look very, very similar, right? For most parts, they could look identical. But you put a really strong runner on a bicycle, they're not going to perform that well. You put a really strong cyclist running, they're not going to perform that well, right? They train differently, the motions that they do are differently. So don't let people convince you that just because two things look alike, they're the same. And the reality is Apple does a ton around security that I think you got to start there, because once you get over that hump, everything else is just around, what are the tools you're going to use to manage. But that usually can stop a conversation from the very beginning. So now we're going to transition, and we're going to get into deployment, and basically what I deem as deployment made easier. I know they said 1, 2, and there's no step 3. I like to say there's actually 4 steps to this process. We could decide if it's a 2, A, B, C, D, or whatever. But the first step we're going to get into is what I call register. And this is going to your Apple Business Manager account, sign up for your enterprise, get the account set up. Once you're within here, right, you have access to things like getting your DEP and VPP account set up. And this is the first conversation I usually have with the client is, do you have a DEP account? If they say yes, that's great. It's kind of a smoother path. If they say no, there's usually an education around what is DEP, and helping them understand what that is, as well as kind of what VPP is. And the reason I always start here, one is it's free, right? So you don't have to pay for the advantage of using those tools. 2, it will automate the enrollment into your MDM environment when linked to your MDM. It locks that device into the MDM, and it gives you that higher level of supervision that I suspect many of you are aware of. And then obviously VPP, when you think about licensing and how do you control the licensing and everything else with that, and how do you buy these apps from the App Store in volume and distribute those, VPP is perfect for that. Not only is it helping you with the licensing, but you get this ability to distribute at volume within your enterprise. So that's, to me, is the first step that you want to do when you're kind of going across this. The second step is actually setting up your MDM. Naturally, we always recommend Jamf for managing Apple-based devices. That's kind of our lead with. But once you got your Jamf environment, the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to link up your DEP and VPP accounts to your Jamf environment, right? After you've linked up your accounts, the next thing you're going to do is link up your conditional access. So whether that's today you saw Okta from Jamf Connect and where they're going with the Azure AD and Office 365, getting that authentication, getting that conditional access, getting that all connected and working, getting that configured. And then once you have that, obviously the last thing is you got to set up your profiles, you're going to put your policies in, and you're going to configure everything that you ultimately want pushed out to those devices from a management perspective. And once you have that, you're able to start this kind of over-the-air deployment in minutes, right? And this is really, really important because this idea that IT never has to touch the device, right? It's all done over the air, and depending on your distribution points and your networking, it could take as little as a few minutes, right? Obviously, I caveat that with where are your distribution in your network, but it's not something that takes days, and it's not something that takes hours. It usually is minutes. But not only that, but it is going to ensure that device compliance, because the fact that it's enrolled into DEP, into the MDM, 1, it's forced the enrollment, and 2, it's going to push all those policies by default down to the device and ensure you're compliant out of the gate. And the beauty of DEP, if that device is ever lost or stolen, somebody tries to factory reset, it basically becomes a brick. So you don't have to worry about that device, getting maliciously used in those cases. On top of that, you get the seamless integration, so you get that added level of security for your applications and the use around that, and it enables self-service. And we'll come back to self-service because this is a really critical component. The next thing is you're ready to ship the device. So some companies will kind of give a pre-configured hardware choices, or they'll just define this is the Mac option you have, this is a PC option you have. Some companies will give you a catalog where you can go in and select which ones you want. However you do that, that's not really the key factor. The key factor is how do you preserve the consumer experience? So that experience where you saw earlier during the keynote today, where it's still shrink wrapped. It's got the Post-it note on it, which basically says, "Congratulations, here's your new Mac or your new iPhone or iPad. Take it out of the box, power it on, and it works." Right? And so that's basically what you want to do, right? Nobody touches it. Goes straight to the user. You often hear that referred to as zero-touch deployment. Once you've gotten the device, your next step is simply to power it on. Power it on, calls home to Apple. Apple is going to authenticate it, belongs to a DEP account, right? DEP is then going to push that over to the MDM. MDM will do its magic, run whatever policies or profiles that you've configured down onto that device. It'll be ready in minutes. The user will basically, at that point, they will have a device that has all their applications, all their governance and compliance and security policies pushed onto it, mail, calendar, those types of things will all be configured, and you'll be off and running in a matter of minutes. I mean, it really is an amazing experience for anybody who's done it, and I've witnessed. You guys can look up my LinkedIn profile to figure out where I've come from in my past life, but I've witnessed this where you've had Windows users who just said, "I'll never, never, ever convert." As soon as they went through that experience, they were sold. They didn't even care about the excuses of shortcut keys and having to relearn everything that they knew from their PC world. Just that experience alone was the selling point. So getting that right and doing that right is absolutely critical. So now that, I just lost the screen again. Let's see here. All right, well, that's coming back. So I'll keep talking. I know what the next slide is. So now that you got out there, the next thing is self-service. So you got the machine up. And so I always like to say, so you've registered it, right? You've set up the MDM. You've deployed it. That last step is actually support, right? You cannot ignore support. It's not an issue of whether or not Apple needs more support. I think yes, that's right. It's just that there's always going to be an issue. Sometimes it's user-driven, sometimes it's your network, sometimes it's whatever, right? There's always going to be a need for support. But self-service should become your first line of defense for support, right? There's going to be time, but not everybody wants self-service, right? Some people are just more comfortable talking to somebody on the phone. So you're going to need to provide remote support for those people. Some people, whether they're VIP or whatever it is, they want that high-touch on-site support, right? So you need to provide those options. And even the person who wants self-service, they're not always actually going to be able to solve that problem, and there's going to be times where they need tickets, right? And I think you even saw those stats from Fletcher this morning where, their number of tickets comes down, but there's still times where people do need to call in for a ticket. But the key is that you're providing them with a choice, right? A user has that option to go down a self-service path, go down a remote support path, or go down this on-site support path. And giving them that option, once again, you're empowering them with choice to figure out how they best share in that responsibility of solving their IT problems and challenges, right? And so this is a critical component of that conversation. So we kind of quickly went through kind of a little bit of background, kind of how Apple really helped us rethink what's possible, and kind of got into how easy it is to deploy. But the real core of what I wanted to share with you today, isn't that it's easy to deploy. I think you've seen that in a number of sessions. It's really how do you actually get people inside your company to say yes to offering employee choice, right? And what are those success factors? And so when I talk about success factors, it's not success factors in the sense of here's how you properly set up your MDM and those things. It's how do I convince the organization to make the change? And change is inevitable. Today, more so than ever before, with the adoption of technology, with a workforce that's been coming in for the last probably 10, 15 years now that has grew up in the digital world. So, for me, when I started my career, people didn't really have a lot of IT skills. So they just relied on their IT team to tell them what they needed to do. Today's workforce is very different. They kind of tell IT what to do because they typically are as informed about the new tools, technology, and capability that's out there. And so this idea that you need to embrace this change, and how do you go about it? Because with change, there's always resistance, right? And so as the evangelist in the room, how do we convince those key stakeholders that it's good for them, right? And so that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about here, right? And so we talk about, there's 3 factors that will dictate the level of success in you getting to that decision to go with choice. And we're going to start with the key stakeholders. And, we're going to zip through a handful of these. So the first one we're going to start with is the CEO. Maybe. Let's see here. It'll rebuild. Give it a second. Is the CEO. So the CEO is tasked with, transforming a business, driving a business at scale, and really delivering that value back to its shareholders. And so if you can convince the CEO and get them on your side, not only is it helping them drive their transformational agenda, but typically your face to your client is the employee. And so if they're walking and talking and breathing in a new way, and they're feeling empowered and they've got this satisfaction about their workplace environment, that translates over to the customer, right? And those are things that CEOs will get excited about. CFO is a very different conversation. Often a conversation can start and stop right with the CFO. And I think many of us kind of understand the dynamic here, which is there is a perception that I think is slowly going away, but it's still there and quite prevalent, that an Apple device is more expensive than a non-Apple device when deploying in the enterprise. And that's because typically all they do is they look at the sticker price of the physical device. And even then, it's kind of unfairly treated, because if you look at an enterprise class PC device, they're typically not that same price of a consumer one, and they're not that different in price. But the good news is, when you look at the TCO of doing a choice program that is done properly, and there are plenty of ways to do a choice program that don't help you financially, but if you do this in a way that really reimagines what's possible and leveraging the native tools and technologies that are inherent in these devices, you can truly get to something that is, from a total cost of ownership, cheaper, at least neutral, but typically cheaper than what you see in the PC environment, because of the native tools and the support side of this. Apple devices, I'm not making it up, there's plenty of data out there that proves it, just have less problems. So you get less calls, you get less tickets, because the hardware and software are built for each other, right? So the CFO is a very interesting conversation. HR, you saw this today. I mean, it was one of Fletcher's top things he had on the keynote this morning was attract and retain talent, right? People today, I showed you the stats earlier, they want a choice. They know the tools that they want, they know the applications, they know the devices they want. Giving that choice, 1, helps attract them, but 2, it helps empower them. It drives workplace satisfaction. These are all things that the HR, your chief human resource officer, is tasked with, and it helps drive that agenda from a culture and satisfaction perspective. CISO to me is probably one of the toughest jobs in today's environment, because the definition of good security changes almost hourly. And so how do you sit down with that CISO, help them understand what those security capabilities are, how when you leverage things like DEP and an MDM, you can drive these different levels of compliance. Now you've got these wonderful reports that are coming out in the new DOT release out of Jamf. You get the conditional access components of that. So it's a whole new level of security and capability. And so how do you help them understand that by implementing these new capabilities and tools, you're actually helping them solve some of their primary #1 issues? I mean, these are the things that when they have a data breach, those are things these guys lose their job over. So that's why they're always paranoid on anything security. And if it's unfamiliar, they're even more paranoid about adopting it, right? Because this is where people lose their job if you're a CISO, if you have an issue here. So if they're not familiar, they're going to naturally gravitate back to what they do know. So this is, once again, you got to have that deep security conversation. And then you've got legal. And so legal might seem a bit of a strange one for this conversation. But when you think about all the compliance and regulations, regardless of industry, that are out there, and the latest and greatest with GDPR compliance that's out there, I mean, this is something you can't ignore. And so, one, you can get the compliance things around the reporting with the MDM, and you can kind of demonstrate the policies you have there. But in addition to that, there's the data protection, the data governance, and those types of things as well. So one of the partners who's down with us that we work with regularly, Druva, if you haven't checked them out, they've got a phenomenal data governance, compliance posture. But there's some interesting things there around e-hold, e-discovery, legal hold type of capability where IT doesn't even have to get involved. So that added layer of trying to get a hard drive from a machine, it might be encrypted, it might not. You got people involved, and it's very sensitive because it's a legal related matter. So the more people you have touching it, the more risk you're creating. You can eliminate all that. It's just a new way of thinking about how you can approach things from a legal perspective. But any one of these could be your champion to help go drive choice, right? Because all of these new tools and new capabilities that bringing in a choice program offers allows you to look at how you do security differently, how you do deployment differently, how do you do compliance differently. And different isn't a bad thing or a good thing. It's just different. And how do you do it that is more intuitive, simple, easier, but actually improves your experience along the way? The next thing I'm going to say is approach. And approach is, I'm deeply passionate about this. I think you've heard this a lot today. Dean said it a number of times, which is around the experience. Like, you just want something that works. Like, I forget what he said. He was using his Star Wars references this morning, but like just IT kind of just fades away, right? And that's really what you want. So when you think about approach, I always say design with the user for the user, right? And what I mean by that is, don't start designing what your program is without actually talking to the people who are going to use whatever it is you're creating. Involve them at the beginning, involve them in the middle when you're actually doing the kind of the test and beta rollouts, and involve them in an ongoing feedback loop channel where they're constantly giving you that feedback in and you're iterating around that. But everything you do should be done around solving the user's pain point, right? How do you really focus in on what is the user's problem? Not what is IT's problem. What is the user's problem? And then how do you figure out how to fold in certain things that you might need from security and governance without disrupting that user experience, right? It's a difficult thing to do, but when you do it, it pays in spades, right? And the other thing is, make sure it's purpose-built. And what I mean by purpose-built for the OS is, don't just try to take your Apple devices and force them into an existing infrastructure just because you have an existing infrastructure, right? I think you've seen downstairs, there's going to be things that are in the Windows environment or an Office 365 or Azure environment, and there's going to be things that are outside that environment. You can make these things coexist, but don't just try to smash them all into one environment out of convenience. Sometimes that's done because you don't want to disrupt vendor relationships, and there's this fear that you lose pricing and other things. But that's because you're trying to manage your relationship and having a difficult conversation with a vendor, and you've lost sight of the user. So when you put all these into context, right, it's user first, solving the user's problem, build it for the OS so that you preserve that experience, right? And then last, make sure you empower the user throughout. Even if that empowerment is a perceived empowerment, this idea of choice, it might just be, the choice of the two machines. They may not have much choice after that, but it's this idea that they got to choose. Same on support. It's this idea that they got to choose. Or I like what, Jamf did with the new releases that are coming out, where it's that in the moment empowerment. You got the little blue dot now. You can kind of see exactly what you need to do for the new feature capability. It's kind of that in the moment empowerment that, hey, I don't know what to do. This is new. What do I do? And that's what we mean by empowering the user throughout the process. And then the last thing is really user experience. So when we talk about user experience, the employee is the number one asset of a company. If you don't have employees, you really don't have a company, right? There's probably a few exceptions in the world, but for the most part, if you don't have employees, right, you really don't have a company. And more so than ever before, the employee knows what they want. They know the device that they are most efficient at, they're most productive at, they're the most collaborative with. Sometimes it depends on the situation on what that device is. They might, navigate across devices depending on given situations. And they know the applications that they want and the tools that they want. And they're very used to actually just being able to go out, download it, install it, and it runs and it works, right? And so the users know what they want. And so how do you tap into that and actually make sure you preserve that user experience? Because a happy employee is your best employee, right? And so how do you drive this employee satisfaction? I mean, you saw actually Fletcher actually put up an NPS score for their employees. Well, that's basically what this is representing, right? You should have an NPS for your employees just like you do for your customers, right? Because if you're not treating your employees properly, guess what? That will carry over to your customer NPS as well. And if you can drive that behavior, you get happy employees, you get empowered, that workplace satisfaction goes up, even in tough times. When businesses are going through tough cycles, if you're giving them this great experience, they feel like they're rally, right? So that was, I think it was the Patriots versus the mercenaries, right? It's all the Patriots are coming together there, as Fletcher referred to. And so the users are absolutely critical, and everything should always start and end with the users. Now, I'm not going to end today with users. I know you only see 3 things, because I think there's one other really important factor that we often forget about, which is when you adopt. The value that you will get and generate for your organization is often driven and dictated by the timing with which you adopt that technology, right? You can think about this from just industry perspectives on new technologies that they're selling into the market, but it's no different in terms of the tools and things that you're adopting inside your company as well. So the timing of when you adopt really matters. And so there's a technology adoption curve that's out there. It's kind of a well-known kind of format, and there's this idea of you got these innovators and early adopters. You've kind of got this early majority, late majority, and then you get these laggards. And so what I'm going to kind of implore to you is that the earlier you are in that cycle, the more value you have the ability to extract out of this. You're taking advantage of that first mover thing. You're attracting the new talent. You're retaining the new talent. You're getting the efficiencies and the benefits out of that reimagined support model. You're really able to extract this value, right? But as that technology emerges and evolves, the amount of value you get it, because now it's kind of, everybody else is doing it, so I'm doing it, and you're not necessarily going to attract people because of it now, because it's kind of become the norm. So you start to lose out those benefits. So incrementally, you start losing the value that you generate for your organization. And then obviously, the later you wait, there's less risk in adopting, but there's also less value that it brings to your organization. So there's a risk equation associated with this, and different companies fall in different places depending on kind of their risk appetite for adopting new technologies, which is why you don't get immediately value out the gate. There's a little bit of a ramp there, but there's tremendous value. And so not only do I implore you to not go and talk to your stakeholders around how great Apple devices are, talk to them in a way that employee choice is just good business. Right? When you give employees a choice, it's good business. It solves a number of issues. It solves your transformation agenda. It helps your HR agendas on attracting and retaining. You can drive new security, improve security, higher compliance around that. It actually solves the agenda items of these senior C-suite executives. So you're actually helping them, right? You're not just trying to convince them that you want Apple because everybody's saying they want Apple. You're actually solving their problems. So when you actually talk to these parties, you got to kind of put yourself in their shoes and say, why do they care? And have the conversation in that context and help you. And then the next battle is, okay, well, let's play around and have this conversation, right? The longer we wait, the less that we're going to be able to generate for our company and our shareholders from a value perspective and really attracting, retaining, and getting all those benefits along with that. So anyway, so I'm going to wrap there. Key success factors, stakeholders, drive it around the user. It's user, 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 right? And do it early and don't wait, right? Because if you wait, you may not be around too long to take advantage of the benefits. And so with that, I am going to bring up, as we introduced him as the Padawan, Tim Lydon. So Tim actually leads our Apple Device Services offering for Wipro globally. He's going to share a little bit. So Tim's got a ton of experience working with clients, working with our internal CIO. So we internal to Wipro as well. We are putting all of our Macs on Jamf. So that we started that earlier in the year since we've joined, and we're along that journey. And Tim's going to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Michael. One of the things that's great about my job is I get to talk to IT executives all the time about their choice programs. And, these are large global organizations that, thousands of employees, and they generally have a pocket or two here and there of people that are running, Mac within their organization. But they really want to, embrace choice and expand it to everyone. But the thing that I hear all the time is that, well, currently we have help desk, and it's 365 days a year, and it's 24/7, and I can't do that, unless I do that for Mac. I have to because I do it for Windows. Well, that's not the case, right? Part of this choice program is people choosing that with this new program may come a different support model, right? Maybe it's going to be 9 to 5 during business hours, because the people that are going to be choosing the Mac are the ones that have already been working with them. They have they're used to self-support in the past, and they're not expecting to get any 24/7 service. So if somebody requires 2 a.m. support and finish, well, then maybe the Mac isn't the right choice for them, right? Because it doesn't make sense for their business model, right? But part of choosing is choosing, hey, I can choose these different support models. A second anecdote I have is about a rollout that recently went on at a large international organization, and we were doing a Jamf rollout, and the project got a little bit held up, right? It was taking a little bit longer, but it was held up by, of all teams, it was marketing and branding that was holding things up, because they said we have to push out the corporate image on the desktop of all these Macs. And we advised against it and said, hey, listen, no, we don't think that's a great idea. But some battles aren't worth fighting, and they let when the official image was decided upon, it was pushed out to all the machines. And I'll bet, as you can imagine, there was instant feedback, and it was brutal, right? What your big brother's taking over my machine, what happened to the picture of my dog, emails to the CIO. And the feedback on the internal Yammer group was just brutal. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? This is just awful. So they changed, reverted course very quickly. But what this company learned was that back to what Michael was talking about in the user experience. You always have to remember what that user experience is going to be for the people that are working with the devices, and also that feedback is key. Right, you need to leverage whatever tools you may have within your organization, Yammer, Google Hangouts, or Slack, whatever that is, wherever that community is. You need to monitor that and maintain and keep an eye on it to get the pulse of your community. So,
Brilliant. So I think with that, I know we're right at the hour. We went probably longer than we were anticipating, but if there's any questions, we can do now. But we are conveniently located right next to the food. You practically run into our booth as you're eating your food, and you might even land in one of our couches. So feel free to swing by and ask any questions. Also, as I said, you can talk to a couple of our partners that are down there as well. But we're happy to take a question or two now if there's any. All right, it's easy, it's simple. You guys got it. Let's go get choice in the enterprise. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, everyone.